The air in an airport terminal is a unique blend of nervous energy and stale promise. For Dr. Julian Vance, it was the familiar scent of his own creation. But that evening, the crisp, recycled air of Chicago O'Hare's new globalist terminal carried a different, acrid note. The stench of baseless suspicion. A man in a stiff, ill-fitting uniform, Officer Mark Renshaw, held his passport and boarding pass, his thumb rubbing over Julian's photograph as if trying to erase the man in front of him. "There's a problem here," Renshaw said, his voice a low grumble of authority. The problem wasn't with the documents. The problem, as it so often was with the face that matched the photograph. Julian was about to be barred from a flight, from a building born from his own mind, and a storm of brutal, life-altering karma was gathering just beyond the horizon. The Globalis terminal at Chicago O'Hare International was a cathedral of modern travel, its vaulted ceilings supported by soaring, biomimetic columns that branched out like a steel forest, were designed to evoke a sense of calm and wonder. Sunlight, even on a gloomy autumnal afternoon, was captured and diffused through a complex system of smart glass and skylights, bathing the grand concourse in a soft, ethereal glow. Every curve of the polished concrete, every sustainably sourced oak panel, every seamless integration of technology was the result of 5 years of obsessive work, a symphony of architecture and engineering conducted by one man, Dr. Julian Vance. Julian, however, looked nothing like the stuffy, bow-tied image of a world-renowned architect. He was dressed for the transatlantic haul to London in a simple, dark grey cashmere sweater, comfortable charcoal trousers, and a pair of well-worn leather sneakers. He carried a single, beautifully crafted leather satchel containing his laptop, a sketchbook, and a worn copy of Meditations. At 48, his hair was cut short, flecked with distinguished silver at the temples, and his face was one of thoughtful composure. He was a man who preferred the quiet language of blueprints and structural steel to the clamour of public attention. He was flying to London to see his mother. Her health had taken a sudden, sharp turn, and the doctor's call had been soberingly direct. Every moment mattered. He'd booked the first available seat on British Airways Flight 296, his mind already thousands of miles away, rehearsing words of comfort and bracing for the unknown. He approached the boarding gate, C12, feeling a familiar, subtle pride. He saw how the flow of human traffic moved organically through the space, how the signage he'd agonized over was effortlessly guiding people, how the light played on the titanium fins of the exterior. It was working. His vision was alive. That feeling of quiet satisfaction evaporated the moment he met the eyes of the man checking documents at the front of the priority boarding line. Officer Mark Renshaw was a man compacted by resentment. He was in his mid-50s, with a thick neck that strained against the collar of his uniform from AeroGuard Solutions, the private security firm contracted by the airport. He held a position of supervisory authority, a fact he signaled with his rigid posture and the way his gaze swept over passengers, not as people, but as potential infractions. Renshaw had been with AeroGuard for 15 years, watching younger, college-educated men and women leapfrog him into management. He felt the world was changing in ways that left him behind, and his small zone of authority at the boarding gate was the one place he could push back. He took Julian's passport and first-class boarding pass. His eyes flickered from the documents to Julian's face, then back again. A beat of silence. Then another. "Just a moment, sir," Renshaw said, his tone flat. He waved the next passenger through, motioning for Julian to step to the side. Julian, accustomed to the vagaries of travel, complied without a word, assuming it was a random check. He stood patiently, watching other passengers file past, their faces a mixture of curiosity and studied indifference. Renshaw finished with a family of 4 before turning his attention back to Julian's documents. He held the passport up to the light, angled it, and then ran his thumb over the laminated photo page. "Vance, Julian Vance," he muttered, sounding the name out as if it were foreign and complex. "This flight is heading to London Heathrow, is that correct?" "Yes, it is," Julian replied, his voice calm and even. "And what is the purpose of your travel?" Renshaw asked. The question was unnecessary. He wasn't customs or immigration. He was a gate guard. A flicker of annoyance pierced Julian's composure, but he kept it in check. "I'm visiting my mother. She's unwell." Renshaw grunted, unimpressed. He stared at Julian's face again. "You look a little different than your picture." Julian resisted the urge to sigh. The photo was 4 years old. He had a few more grey hairs. "It's me." "What do you do for a living, Mr. Vance?" Renshaw pressed, his eyes narrowing. This was the question, the one that always felt like a test. Julian had learned through decades of experience that his reality often sounded like a fabrication to men like Renshaw. He kept his answer simple. "I'm an architect." Renshaw's lips tightened into a smirk, a minute, almost imperceptible expression of disbelief. "An architect," he repeated, the words laced with skepticism. He tapped the first-class boarding pass. "Must be a good business to be in." The insinuation was as clear as the smart glass ceiling above them. Julian felt a familiar weariness settle into his bones. He was a black man in casual clothing, holding a premium ticket. And in Renshaw's mind, the equation didn't add up. The only possible solution was that something was fraudulent. "I do all right," Julian said, his voice now carrying a cool edge. "Is there a problem with my documents, officer?" "We're just making sure everything is secure," Renshaw replied, puffing his chest out slightly. "There's a discrepancy I need to verify. Please continue to wait here." He turned and walked over to the airline's gate agent, a young woman named Sarah who looked flustered by the delay. He spoke to her in a low, conspiratorial tone, gesturing back towards Julian. Julian couldn't hear the words, but he could see the doubt forming on Sarah's face as she glanced at him. He saw her nod, her professional deference to the uniformed security officer overriding her own judgment. The final call for boarding echoed through the concourse. Julian's heart tightened. Every minute he was delayed felt like a betrayal to his mother. He saw the last few passengers hurrying on to the jet bridge. The door was about to close. His door. In his terminal. He belonged here more than anyone. Yet, at that moment, he had never felt more like an outsider. The low, insistent beeping of the gate scanner signaled the last of the economy passengers shuffling through. Julian stood in his designated spot of shame, the floor's polished terrazzo reflecting the anxious faces of the gate agents preparing to close the flight. The conversation between Officer Renshaw and the gate agent, Sarah, had grown longer, more animated. Renshaw was doing most of the talking, his gestures sharp and emphatic, while Sarah's shoulders seemed to shrink with every word. Julian finally stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "That is my flight. It's about to depart. If there is a legitimate issue, you need to tell me what it is now." Renshaw turned, a look of triumph on his face. He had been waiting for this. He thrived on confrontation, on the moment his perceived authority was challenged. "Sir, I've told you to wait," Renshaw snapped, his voice now loud enough for the dozen or so people lingering in the gate area to hear. "The agent and I have identified a security concern." "What security concern?" Julian demanded, his patience finally snapping. "My passport is valid. My ticket is in my name. I am not on any watch list. What exactly is the concern?" "The concern, buddy," Renshaw said, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a theatrical, menacing whisper, "is that things don't add up. Your ticket was purchased less than 12 hours ago. One way, first class. That's a red flag. Your signature on the credit card slip doesn't perfectly match the one in your passport from 4 years ago. That's another red flag." These were flimsy, procedural excuses, the kind of discretionary nitpicking that could be applied to half the passengers on any given day. It was a pretext, a paper-thin justification for a gut feeling rooted in prejudice. "I explained my mother is sick. It was an emergency booking," Julian said, his voice tight with frustration. "And signatures can vary slightly. You know that." "This is ridiculous." Sarah, the gate agent, finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "Sir, Officer Renshaw is the supervisor from AeroGuard. We have to follow his protocol. If he says there's a risk of what?" Julian shot back, looking directly at her. "A risk that I'll sit too comfortably, that I'll enjoy the amenities I paid for?" A young man sitting nearby, wearing a university sweatshirt, was now openly filming the interaction with his phone. Renshaw noticed and swelled with self-importance. He was no longer just a guard. He was the star of a drama, the thin line between order and chaos. "All right, that's enough," Renshaw declared, his voice booming across the now quiet gate. "Your aggressive attitude is another major red flag. I'm making the call. You are being denied boarding on security grounds." The words hung in the air, stunning Julian into silence. Denied boarding. It was an absolute, irreversible judgment. "You can't be serious," Julian whispered, the color draining from his face. "My mother." "You should have thought of that before you decided to cause a problem," Renshaw said dismissively. He turned to Sarah. "Close the flight. Now." Sarah looked from Renshaw's stony face to Julian's look of disbelief and anguish. For a moment, she hesitated. Her training told her this was wrong, that the justifications were weak. But the uniformed man beside her, representing the authority of airport security, was insistent. Her fear of professional repercussions won out. With a trembling hand and an apologetic glance at Julian, she typed a command into her computer. A moment later, the agent at the jet bridge door swung the heavy metal portal shut. The definitive metallic thump echoed in the concourse. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a door not just to an airplane, but to his mother's bedside, slamming shut in his face. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him. Everyone was staring. The student with the phone, a businessman in a suit who quickly looked away, a family trying to hush their curious children. He was a spectacle, a problem, a threat. "Now, sir," Renshaw said, enjoying the moment completely, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We need to have a little chat." He put a hand on Julian's arm. The touch was light, but the implication was heavy as lead. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. As Renshaw led him away from the gate and toward a sterile corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only," Julian caught one last glimpse of the gate area. He saw the plaque on the wall near the entrance to the jet bridge, a polished bronze square he had seen installed just 6 months ago. It read, "The Globalis Terminal, a vision of connection and light, lead architect, Dr. Julian Vance, Vance Aurelius Designs." The irony was so profound, so crushingly bitter, it felt like a physical blow. He had built the temple, and now he was being cast out of it by one of its lowest-ranking guards. The security office was a small, windowless box, painted a depressing shade of institutional beige. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old coffee and industrial cleaner. It was a room designed to make people feel small and insignificant, a stark contrast to the soaring, inspirational spaces Julian had so meticulously designed just a few dozen yards away. There were 2 plastic chairs, a metal desk, and a large one-way mirror on the wall. Julian knew that on the other side, someone was likely watching. Renshaw motioned for him to sit. "Empty your pockets onto the desk, and your satchel. Everything." Julian complied, slowly, deliberately. He placed his wallet, his keys, his phone, and the worn copy of Meditations on the scratched laminate surface. He then opened his leather satchel and took out his laptop and sketchbook. Renshaw picked up the sketchbook, his thick fingers fumbling with the delicate pages. He flipped through complex structural diagrams, elegant freehand sketches of building facades, and dense pages of handwritten notes. "What is all this?" Renshaw grunted, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "My work," Julian said, his voice flat. "As I told you, I'm an architect." "Yeah, you said that," Renshaw scoffed, tossing the sketchbook back on the desk with a disrespectful thud. "Looks like a bunch of squiggly lines to me." He poked at Julian's phone. "You get 1 phone call. To your lawyer, I assume." Julian looked at the phone, then at Renshaw's smug face. A lawyer wasn't the right call. A legal battle would take months, years. It wouldn't get him to London. It wouldn't undo the humiliation. What he needed was not a legal solution, but an institutional one. He needed to go to the top of the food chain, right here, right now. An idea began to form, a gambit born of desperation and a deep, intimate knowledge of the very building he was imprisoned in. "I don't need a lawyer," Julian said calmly. "I need to make a different call." Renshaw shrugged. "Suit yourself. You have 5 minutes." Julian picked up his phone. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable. He didn't go to his recent calls or his main contact list. He opened a secure file in his Notes app, one containing the private numbers of every key stakeholder involved in the Globalis terminal project. He scrolled past the heads of construction firms, the city planners, the lead engineers, until he found the entry he was looking for. It was a number he had called many times during late-night design emergencies and early-morning budget crises. He looked at Renshaw. "Just so you know, I'm calling the director of the Chicago Aviation Authority." Renshaw let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, are you now? You think you're going to get the head of the whole airport on the phone? Good luck with that, pal. I'm sure she's just sitting by her phone, waiting for a call from a troublemaker in a security room. Go ahead. Waste your call." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, a picture of absolute confidence. He believed he had Julian cornered, a fraud whose bluffs were becoming more and more pathetic. Julian ignored him. He pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Julian's own heart hammered against his ribs. He was counting on her being a workaholic. He was counting on her recognizing his name. He was counting on her answering. On the 3rd ring, the call connected. A crisp, professional voice, a voice that commanded boardrooms and city council meetings, came through the line. Evelyn Reed. Relief washed over Julian, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He held the phone up, making sure Renshaw could hear. "Evelyn, it's Julian Vance," he said, his voice as steady as he could make it. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Julian, is everything all right? It's after 7 p.m. I thought you'd be in the air by now." Renshaw's smirk faltered. His posture straightened slightly. He clearly hadn't expected a woman to answer, let alone one who knew the caller's name and travel plans. Still, he likely assumed it was a friend, a part of the bluff. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans," Julian said, his eyes locked on Renshaw's. "I'm having a bit of a situation here at the airport. I've been denied boarding on my flight to London." "What?" Evelyn Reed's voice sharpened, losing its casual warmth and taking on the incisive edge of a CEO smelling a crisis. "Denied boarding? On what grounds? Was there an issue with the airline?" "No, not the airline," Julian said, letting a deliberate pause hang in the air. "It was an issue with your contract security. A supervisor from a company called Aero Guard Solutions. I'm currently in a security office near Gate C12, in the Globalis terminal." The mention of the terminal's name was a strategic move. He could almost hear the gears turning in Evelyn Reed's mind. "Julian, where exactly are you?" The authority in her voice was now absolute. "A small office. Room C1 to 13B, I believe," Julian replied, glancing at a small plaque on the door. There was a rustling on the other end of the line, the sound of a chair pushing back, of purpose taking hold. "Stay right where you are. Don't say another word to anyone. I'm on my way." "Thank you, Evelyn," Julian said. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I'm looking at the dedication plaque in the main hall right now. It has your name on it. Whoever is in that room with you has just made the biggest mistake of their professional career." The line went dead. Julian slowly lowered the phone and placed it back on the desk. He looked at Renshaw. The guard's face, once so full of smug certainty, had transformed into a mask of pale, dawning horror. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a blotchy, sallow complexion. He understood now. The casual first-name basis, the mention of the terminal, the raw, undisguised power in the woman's voice. This was not a bluff. The hunter had just realized he had cornered a lion, and its entire pride was on its way. The small, sterile room suddenly felt like a cage of Renshaw's own making. The silence that followed was louder than any of his previous shouts. The 5 minutes that followed the phone call were the longest of Mark Renshaw's life. The oppressive silence of the security office was a vacuum, sucking out all his bluster and bravado, leaving behind only the cold, slimy residue of fear. He kept glancing from Julian's impassive face to the one-way mirror, as if expecting to see his doom approaching. He shifted in his chair, the cheap polyester of his uniform suddenly feeling tight and suffocating. He tried to speak twice, opening his mouth and then closing it, the words of apology or justification dying in his throat. What could he possibly say? Julian, for his part, remained perfectly still. He projected an aura of deep, sorrowful calm. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so" smirk. There was only a profound weariness, the look of a man who had won a battle he never wanted to fight. He picked up his copy of Meditations and simply held it, his fingers tracing the worn cover. Then they heard it. It wasn't a loud sound at first, but a distinct, purposeful cadence echoing from the main concourse. It was the sound of expensive, hard-soled shoes moving with urgency across polished terrazzo. It was a sound of authority, accompanied by the squawk of radios and the murmur of other, deferential voices. It was the sound of a hornet's nest that had just been kicked. The door to the security office burst open without a knock. Standing in the doorway was a woman who radiated power like heat from asphalt. Evelyn Reed was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp, elegant bob, and her eyes, behind a pair of designer glasses, were like chips of ice. She was the director of the Chicago Aviation Authority, a woman who controlled a multi-billion-dollar budget and the daily movements of over 200,000 people. And right now, her entire formidable presence was focused on this tiny, beige room. Flanking her were 2 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department's Airport Division. Actual police, not private security. And a man in a suit whom Julian recognized as Daniel Matthews, the airport's head of operations. Evelyn Reed's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene in a single, practiced glance. Renshaw, frozen in his chair like a startled animal. Julian, calm and composed, the scattered contents of Julian's life on the desk. Her gaze completely bypassed Renshaw, as if he were a piece of furniture. She walked directly to Julian. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice a mixture of deep concern and controlled fury. "On behalf of every single person who works for this airport, I am profoundly and unreservedly sorry for what has happened here. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Evelyn. Just disappointed," Julian replied, his voice quiet. He rose from his chair. "Disappointed is a gross understatement for what this is," she said, her jaw tight. She then turned her head slowly, her icy gaze finally falling upon Mark Renshaw. If a look could incinerate a man, Renshaw would have been a pile of ash. "You," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Stand up." Renshaw scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He looked like a schoolboy caught cheating, his face slick with sweat. "State your name and position," Evelyn commanded. Mark Renshaw, sir." "Ma'am," he stammered. "I'm a security supervisor with AeroGuard Solutions." "AeroGuard," Evelyn repeated the name as if it were a foul taste in her mouth. "Mr. Renshaw, I want you to explain to me, in meticulous detail, the sequence of events that led to you, a contract guard, detaining the chief architect of this very terminal and denying him boarding on a flight for a family emergency. Start from the beginning, and do not leave anything out. Mr. Matthews here will be recording your statement." Daniel Matthews discreetly activated a recording app on his phone. The 2 CPD officers moved to flank the door, their presence an unspoken promise that this was now a very serious, official matter. Renshaw began to speak, his voice trembling. He tried to frame his actions in the sterile language of security protocols. "I observed the passenger, Mr. Vance, and selected him for a routine secondary screening." "Why?" Evelyn cut in, her voice like a whip crack. "What was the specific, observable criterion that led you to select Dr. Vance over any other passenger?" Renshaw hesitated. The real reason was a toxic sludge of prejudice and insecurity he could never articulate. His ticket was a last-minute, one-way purchase, first class. That can be an indicator. An indicator for thousands of business travelers and people with family emergencies every single day, Evelyn retorted. "That is not a sufficient reason." "What else?" "His signature," Renshaw mumbled, his confidence crumbling. It didn't look like a perfect match to the passport. "Did you use the digital verification scanner, as is protocol for a signature query?" Evelyn asked, already knowing the answer. "Well, no, So you relied on your own inexpert opinion over billion-dollar security technology," she stated flatly. "What else?" "He became aggressive," Renshaw said, grasping at his last, most damning lie. Julian, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I asked what the problem was," he said, his voice ringing with clarity. "I told him my mother was ill. I asked him not to close the flight. If that's aggression, then yes, I was aggressive." Evelyn Reed turned to Daniel Matthews. "Get Sarah from gate C12 in here, now." Matthews nodded and spoke into his radio. A minute later, the young gate agent appeared at the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She saw Evelyn Reed and seemed to shrink even further. "Sarah," Evelyn said, her tone softening slightly but still firm, I need you to tell me exactly what you witnessed. Was Dr. Vance aggressive?" Sarah wrung her hands, her eyes darting to Renshaw and then to the floor. She took a deep breath. "No, Mum," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was frustrated. He was upset about missing his flight. But he never raised his voice. He wasn't aggressive. Officer Renshaw was the one. He was the one who was loud. He called him Buddy." The final nail was hammered into Renshaw's professional coffin. He had been exposed, his justification stripped away to reveal the ugly prejudice beneath. He stood there, mute and defeated, as the full weight of the institution he claimed to represent crashed down upon him. The room was no longer his domain. It was Evelyn Reed's courtroom, and judgment was about to be rendered. Evelyn Reed let the gate agent's testimony settle in the silent room. She gave Renshaw a long, cold look, dissecting him with her eyes. He had no power here. His uniform was just a costume, his authority an illusion she was about to shatter completely. "Mr. Renshaw," she began, her voice deceptively calm, "do you have any idea what Dr. Vance means to this city and to this airport? This terminal, the very ground you stand on, was a failing, over-budget project, destined to become a national embarrassment. We brought in Dr. Vance when it was nothing but a concrete shell and a mountain of problems. He personally redesigned over 60% of it. He renegotiated with the structural engineers. He fought with the city council for the right materials. He slept in a trailer on the construction site for weeks at a time to ensure his vision was realized." She took a step closer to him. The Globalis name. That was his. The Forest Concourse, concept that has won a dozen international design awards. That was his. The custom lighting array that syncs with the natural light of the sky to reduce passenger fatigue and save 40% on energy costs. That was his. He poured his soul into this place. This terminal is more his home than it is yours or mine. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Renshaw's face was ashen. He was not just a bully who had picked on the wrong person. He was a vandal who had defaced a masterpiece in front of its creator. "And you," Evelyn continued, her voice dripping with contempt, "in your infinite wisdom, decided that he, the man whose name is literally inscribed on a bronze plaque 50 feet from where you were standing, didn't belong here." She turned to her head of operations. "Daniel, get me Robert Morrison on the phone. Now." The name sent a fresh jolt of terror through Renshaw. Robert Morrison was the CEO of AeroGuard Solutions. He was a name from corporate memos and training videos, a distant, untouchable figure. Daniel Matthews had the number on speed dial. He made the call, and after a brief exchange, handed the phone to Evelyn. "Robert, Evelyn Reed," she said, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "I have a situation here at O'Hare. One of your supervisors, a Mark Renshaw, has illegally detained and denied boarding to Dr. Julian Vance." She paused. "Yes, that Dr. Julian Vance, the architect of the Globalis terminal. No, I'm not joking." The entire room could hear the faint, tinny squawk of a panicked voice on the other end of the line. "Here's what's going to happen, Robert," Evelyn said, cutting him off. "Mr. Renshaw's employment with your company is terminated, effective immediately. He is to be stripped of his credentials and escorted off airport property by the Chicago Police Department. He will be permanently banned from O'Hare International Airport, not just as an employee, but as a traveler. His profile is to be flagged for cause across all national security databases we have access to." Renshaw made a small, choking sound. His entire career, his entire livelihood, had just been erased in a 30-second phone call. "But we're not done, Robert," Evelyn continued, her voice becoming even colder. "I want a copy of Renshaw's complete file on my desk within the hour. Every commendation, every complaint, every performance review. I suspect this isn't his first time abusing his authority, and your company's failure to act is a direct breach of your contractual obligations." Another pause as the panicked voice resumed. "Save it. AeroGuard's multi-million-dollar contract with the Chicago Aviation Authority is hereby suspended, pending a full and immediate review by my board and the city's Inspector General. We will be investigating your hiring practices, your training protocols, and your oversight mechanisms. I suggest you get your legal team in order. You'll be hearing from our lawyers by morning." She ended the call without saying goodbye and handed the phone back to Daniel. The sentence had been passed. The execution was swift. She nodded to the two CPD officers. "Please escort Mr. Renshaw to collect his personal effects from his locker and then escort him from the premises. He is not to speak to any other airport personnel." One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, please turn around and place your hands behind your back." It wasn't an arrest, but the procedure was just as humiliating, designed to ensure he couldn't access a weapon or cause a scene. They removed his badge, his radio, his airport ID, and a set of keys from his belt, placing them on the desk. Each item removed seemed to diminish him further, stripping away the layers of his assumed identity until he was just a defeated, middle-aged man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. As they led him out of the room, Mark Renshaw's eyes met Julian's one last time. There was no anger in them anymore. There was no defiance. There was only a hollow, pleading despair. He had flown too close to the sun, on wings of prejudice and ego, and now he was plunging back to earth, his entire world burning up around him. He was walked out the way he had come, but this time he was the one being watched. He was walked through the stunning concourse, past the soaring columns he'd never noticed, under the magnificent ceiling he'd never appreciated. And as he was guided toward the exit, a pariah in the palace he was supposed to be guarding, he was forced to walk directly past the bronze dedication plaque. He couldn't help but read the elegantly engraved words, "Lead Architect, Dr. Julian Vance." The terminal was a monument to one man's genius, and his career was now a monument to his own foolishness. The karma that befell Mark Renshaw was not a single, explosive event, but a slow, crushing cascade of consequences. The initial firing was just the first stone in an avalanche. Evelyn Reed was true to her word. The investigation into AeroGuard Solutions was swift and brutal. Renshaw's file, as she had suspected, was damning. It revealed a distinct pattern of behavior stretching back years. There were more than a dozen minor complaints filed against him by travelers, most of them people of color, citing overly aggressive questioning, unwarranted searches, and a condescending attitude. Each complaint had been handled internally by a low-level HR manager at AeroGuard, with a slap on the wrist and a note in his file that was subsequently ignored. He had been passed over for promotion to a corporate position 3 times due to poor interpersonal skills, a euphemism for the bigotry his direct superiors were aware of but had never properly addressed. The young man who had filmed the initial confrontation at the gate had uploaded his video before his own flight even took off. By the time Julian was settling into the airline lounge, the clip was already going viral. Titled, "Airport Guard Racially Profiles and Bars Man from Flight," it rocketed across Twitter, Reddit, and news aggregators. The story was irresistible. The dramatic confrontation, the clear abuse of power, and the spectacular, ironic twist. Major news outlets like CNN, the BBC, and the New York Times picked it up. Their reporters dug deeper. They found the dedication plaque. They found Dr. Julian Vance's extensive and celebrated portfolio. The story exploded. AeroGuard Solutions was plunged into a full-blown corporate crisis. Their stock price, which had been stable for years, plummeted by 30% in 2 days of trading, wiping out nearly $1 billion in market value. The CEO, Robert Morrison, was forced to issue a groveling public apology. But the damage was done. The city of Chicago officially opened a formal review of their contract, and soon other airports and municipalities that contracted with AeroGuard in Atlanta, in Dallas, in Miami, announced they were doing the same. The company that had ignored Mark Renshaw's quiet bigotry for years was now paying a very loud and public price. They were forced to clean house, firing not only Renshaw, but the regional manager who had overseen him and the HR director who had buried the complaints. For Mark Renshaw, the public sphere was just the beginning of his private hell. His name and face were everywhere. He was the subject of angry editorials and late-night talk show monologues. He became a meme, a symbol of petty tyranny and prejudice. He had to delete his social media accounts to escape the torrent of vitriol. His neighbors recognized him from the news and began to shun him. The local grocery store became a gauntlet of angry stares and whispered insults. His termination for cause meant he was ineligible for severance pay. With his name now toxic in the security industry, he couldn't find another job. The calls from recruiters stopped. His applications were met with silence. Within 3 months, he had drained his savings. The bank sent a notice of foreclosure on the modest suburban house he had spent 2 decades paying for. His wife, who claimed she had endured years of his bitterness and resentment, finally left him, telling him his public humiliation was simply the person she knew at home being revealed to the world. He ended up losing the house and moving into a rundown apartment complex on the edge of the city. His final, crushing dose of karma came 6 months after the incident. Broke and desperate, he took the only job he could get, a night shift janitor for a commercial cleaning company. His first assignment was a large downtown office building. On his 3rd night, as he was emptying trash cans in a sleek, minimalist lobby, he looked up at the building directory. The primary tenant, occupying the top 10 floors, was listed in elegant silver lettering. Vance Aurelius Designs, North American headquarters. He was cleaning the floors of the very company owned by the man whose life he had tried to ruin. He was, quite literally, cleaning up a mess in Julian Vance's world. Meanwhile, Dr. Julian Vance was being taken care of. Evelyn Reed had personally escorted him to the British Airways first-class lounge. The airline, horrified by the incident and the viral video, bent over backwards to apologize. They bumped him to their most exclusive private suite on the next flight out, a cabin usually reserved for royalty and heads of state. The flight manager personally came to offer his apologies, and the CEO of the airline called Julian's cell phone before takeoff to do the same. On the flight, in the quiet solitude of his private cabin high above the Atlantic, Julian finally had time to process. He felt no joy in Renshaw's downfall. He felt only a deep, profound sorrow. The incident wasn't a victory. It was a symptom of a disease that he had to face far too often. He had been profiled in high-end stores, pulled over in his own expensive car, and questioned by police in his own affluent neighborhood. But this was different. This was personal. To be treated as an intruder in a space that was the most intimate and complete expression of his professional soul was a wound that would take a long time to heal. He arrived in London and made it to his mother's bedside. She was frail, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. He sat with her, held her hand, and told her stories, not of airports and angry men, but of his childhood, of the buildings he'd dreamed of as a boy. He was where he needed to be. In the end, he had made it home, but the journey had cost him, and Mark Renshaw far more than the price of a ticket. Weeks turned into months in the gentle, grey light of London. Julian's world shrank to the quiet rhythm of his mother's recovery. He spent long afternoons in her hospital room, the sterile beeps of monitors a strange counterpoint to the warm intimacy of their conversations. He read to her from novels she'd loved in her youth, and she, in turn, would watch him sketch in his notebook, her gaze full of a mother's uncomplicated pride. She knew something had happened at the airport. She could read the shadow that sometimes passed behind his eyes, but he deflected her questions with a gentle wave. He was here to be her son, not a man burdened by a global news story. He was here to heal. But the world outside the hospital walls refused to let the story fade. His firm's public relations team in Chicago called him daily at first, then weekly with updates. The video of the confrontation had been viewed over 100 million times. His name was trending. He had, against every one of his instincts, become a public figure. He was no longer just Dr. Julian Vance, the architect. He was the Dr. Julian Vance, the man who designed the terminal that tried to reject him. Invitations began to pour in, not just from news outlets wanting a soundbite, but from universities, civil rights organizations, and even corporate boards, all wanting him to speak. His first instinct was to refuse them all. He was a designer, a builder, a man who spoke through steel and light, not into microphones. But as he sat in the quiet of his London flat one evening, scrolling through messages from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of humiliation and prejudice, he felt a shift. His story was no longer just his. It had become a vessel for the quiet indignities suffered by countless others. To remain silent felt like a betrayal. His first major appearance was at the World Architecture Forum in Berlin. Standing on a stark, minimalist stage, he looked out at the faces of his peers, the most celebrated designers and engineers on the planet. He began not with the incident, but with his craft. He spoke of tensile strength and load distribution, of the physics of light and the psychology of color. Then he pivoted. A building is more than just shelter. It is a physical manifestation of our values, he began, his voice quiet but resonant in the large hall. A courthouse should feel like justice. A library should feel like wisdom. An airport terminal. An airport should feel like a welcome. It is the handshake of a city, the first embrace of a nation. It is a place of hellos and goodbyes, of new beginnings and poignant ends. It is, by its very nature, a deeply human space. He took a breath. The design of the Globalis terminal was guided by a single principle, that every person who enters it, regardless of where they come from or who they are, should feel seen, respected, and safe. That they should feel as if the space itself is helping them on their journey. I wanted the light to guide them, the high ceilings to lift their spirits. I wanted the flow of the concourse to feel as natural as a river. He looked directly at the audience, his gaze unflinching. On an autumn evening last year, for me, my own building failed. And it wasn't because of a flaw in the steel or a crack in the foundation. The flaw was in a human heart. It was a failure of empathy, a failure of sight. One man, entrusted with a small measure of power, looked at me and did not see a fellow man, a passenger, or even the architect of the very floor he stood upon. He saw only a threat, a problem to be solved, an anomaly to be contained. We can build the most magnificent structures in the world, he concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. But if we don't build a better, more understanding society to inhabit them, then we have only created beautiful, empty shells. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous and long. His speech was translated and republished around the globe. He had transformed his personal humiliation into a powerful, universal lesson. Back in Chicago, Evelyn Reed used the momentum as a cudgel for change. AeroGuard Solutions was not only fired, but dismantled by lawsuits and contract losses. The Vance Protocol was formally implemented at O'Hare. It mandated that any security flag requiring a passenger to be detained for more than 5 minutes had to be escalated to a senior airport authority manager, taking final judgment out of the hands of private guards. Mandatory, continuous de-escalation, and implicit bias training, audited by an independent third party, became a non-negotiable clause in all future security contracts. A year to the day after the incident, Julian flew back to Chicago. Walking through the Globalis terminal was a surreal experience. It was his creation, yet it felt new, changed by the lens of his experience. A United Airlines pilot stopped him near the main concourse. "Dr. Vance," he said, extending a hand. "Just wanted to say thank you. What you went through, it made a difference for a lot of us." Evelyn Reed met him at the cafe overlooking the Great Hall. They watched the ceaseless, graceful flow of humanity that Julian had orchestrated. "The ripple effect has been staggering," Evelyn said, shaking her head in amazement. "We're getting calls from airport authorities from Sydney to Stockholm, all wanting to know about the new protocols. You didn't just fix a problem here, Julian. You started an industry-wide conversation." She grew quiet for a moment. "We found out what happened to him, you know. Renshaw." Julian looked at her, his expression unreadable. "He lost everything," she said, her voice flat. "The house, his pension, his marriage. Last we heard, he was a janitor. Works nights for a company that cleans some of the downtown high-rises. He cleans the lobby of your firm's building." The irony was so crushingly perfect that it offered no satisfaction. Julian looked out the vast window at a plane lifting gracefully into the sky. He felt a pang, not of pity, but of a deep, philosophical melancholy. Renshaw was a man poisoned by bitterness, a man who had tried to cure his own feelings of smallness by making others feel smaller. And in his most significant attempt, he had targeted a giant and been crushed by the fallout. There was no victory in it. It was just a tragedy, spiraling out from a single, ugly moment of prejudice. "I hope he finds some peace," Julian said, and he was surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. He finished his coffee and stood up to leave. As he walked alone through the Great Hall, the afternoon sun streamed through the skylights he had positioned with such care. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air and cast long shadows from the forest-like columns. He saw people of every race, every nationality, every creed, rushing to their flights, embracing loved ones, starting their journeys. He saw a young black father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the planes, her laughter echoing in the vast space. His building was working. It was alive. It was welcoming the world. And today he felt like he finally, truly belonged in it again. The wound had not vanished. It never would entirely. But it had become a scar. And like the controlled fractures in tempered glass that give it strength, the scar was a reminder not of the moment of impact, but of everything that had held together in spite of it. It was a reminder of the enduring importance of building a world with more light, more connection, and more open doors. The story of Dr. Julian Vance and Officer Mark Renshaw is a stark and powerful reminder that our world, for all its modern marvels, is still built on simple human interactions. A building of glass and steel, no matter how brilliant, is only as strong as the character of the people within it. It teaches us that prejudice is a poison, not just for the victim, but for the perpetrator, setting in motion a chain of events that can unravel a life built on bitterness. Julian's experience was a crucible, forging his quiet dignity into a global voice for change, while Renshaw's abuse of his small power led to his total ruin. It's a testament to the fact that in our hyper-connected age, the consequences for our actions can be swift, total, and profoundly ironic. If this story resonated with you and served as a powerful illustration of how karma and justice can unfold in the most unexpected ways, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with others who appreciate tales of profound irony and consequence. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true-life stories that explore the depths of the human condition, where a single moment can change everything. Thank you for listening.